The unique thing about Waymo here, what people don't appreciate the details is that in New York State, the way AVs are regulated, you have the DMV on a state level.
Mm-hmm.
Then in New York City, you have the Department of Transportation, where it actually technically regulates AVs. But this is what people miss out on. If you're doing a paid AV trip,
Mm-hmm.
that is actually regulated by the Taxi and Limousine Commission. If I told you there was an employer in New York City that employs 120,000 people, which is Uber plus taxi,
Mm-hmm.
one of the largest
Mm.
employers in New York City.
Dawood Milan is the founder of Auto Marketplace, the leading platform covering New York City's TLC industry. He began his career in finance before launching an Uber Black Fleet in New York City in 2016, growing from one BMW to over 25 vehicles. In 2020, he founded Auto Marketplace, though, to fill the gap in reliable TLC industry insights. Dawood still operates his fleet, advises other owners, and his goal is to bring more transparency to NYC's taxi, TLC, plate, and insurance markets. Dawood, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, Harry. Thanks a lot for having me on.
I'm excited to chat with you, and I might have to let you do most of the chatting today because I already kind of stumbled through your bio. But, we met recently. Well, I guess we've known each other for a long time, and we met in person recently during our New York City AV Summit. So I appreciate you coming out and inviting a bunch of great fleet owners. But I really wanted to kind of dive deep into this New York City market. And before I say why I think it's important, why don't you tell me, like, why should we care about the New York City TLC market?
Yeah. And I think you're going to make that you've been in the rideshare business long enough to understand the importance. But I think New York City is unique in the sense that I think when people think about Uber, the rise of Uber or Lyft, they just assume it completely took out the pre-existing taxi industry that existed in every market. As you know, Harry, in New York City, it's probably the only market in the United States. When I talk about a market, I mean for Uber X, the regular product or Lyft product, that actually had to abide by existing taxi commission rules. And so I think that's super interesting. And the second reason, and I guess an equal reason it's super interesting, is just the value of this market. If it's by definitely dollar amount, it's the most valuable market in the world, definitely in the United States. And then the third reason, I'll just put this in without taking too much time, is the insurance equation is extremely interesting in New York City, because in all other markets outside of New York City, Uber and Lyft are paying for the insurance. In New York City, the fleet and the vehicle owner or license holder is paying for the insurance. So that actually makes it the most disruptable market because a new incumbent doesn't have to figure out the insurance equation. And so the taxi medallion is not dead in New York City. Probably in every other market, it's dead. So I think those are like three kind of high level reasons it's super interesting.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that I'm curious to hear from my audience what they think about New York City if they sort of put it on this pedestal of, this top market, because I know I do similar to you. And obviously, New York City has been in the news a lot lately because Waymo and others are looking to test and, autonomous vehicles are basically looking after New York City. And I have to imagine that kind of like you mentioned, I think they're sort of, well, I think definitely revenue wise, right? Folks in the industry know that, there are 600,000 trips. I think there's a good website that I like to cite, wschneider.com, where he tracks, since the Taxi and Limousine Commission for New York City provide data. So you can see trips. Actually, I've got it pulled up right here, 647,819 trips per day for ride hailing apps as of September 2025, and 138,644 trips per day for taxis. So that's a lot of trips and a lot of money.
And then about 10%, a lot of people don't know this, about 9 to 10% of the market is still like traditional black car bases, believe it or not.
Oh, interesting. So this would be
900,000 trips per day market, and then multiply by the revenue. It's a huge market.
Yeah, it looks like the revenue is actually $35 per trip for ride hail and $25 per trip. I sound really smart, but I'm just reading off of Todd's site right now. So I really do not know these stats like the back of my hand.
It's like the multiplier is huge. To your point, it's just like it's a really big market. And the insurance equation makes it an extremely profitable market for Uber.
Interesting.
Insurance.
Got it. So we'll definitely touch on insurance. I know that's everyone's favorite topic in the shared fleet industry. But one thing you said about the New York City market stood out to me. It's the only market where in the US, where Uber had to abide by existing taxi and limousine commission rules, basically, right? Where you need to be a licensed driver by the TLC and you need to provide commercial insurance as a driver instead of the platform doing it like in every other city. So that's pretty unique. Why is that? Why couldn't Uber get its way? I'm sure they didn't want it like that, right?
I think, yeah, no, I think the taxi, now this is my opinion, but I think the yellow cab, there was a pre-existing kind of what they call black car base, traditional base industry. So
Mhm.
Uber very neatly fit into that. And also you had a huge medallion lobby. And, the medallion at its height in 2014 was worth more than $1 million. Multiply that by 13,000. That's a 15, $20 billion
Mm.
plus industry and the
Yeah.
political clout that comes with that. I think when Uber and Lyft launched here, I think like New York City politics was kind of like, okay, what are our defense mechanisms? How
Mm.
we defend against this? And they're saying, okay, if when Uber launched here, it was like Uber Black, that was the
Mhm.
product. So it wasn't really seen as a threat to the street hail yellow cab. So they
Yeah.
said, okay, if you're going to do Uber Black, there's not a cap on the for hire vehicle license. And so I think New York said, okay, if you're going to launch in this market, and I think this is going to be the similar with Waymo and AV companies, it's just too lucrative a market, too
Yeah.
many existing players that they made sure that, this is not a free for all situation. That you have to abide by the regulations.
Yeah.
Some
I think,
regulations.
yeah, without getting too much in the weeds and speculating too much, I think you're right. There was a lot of money at stake. I think, excuse me, maybe before Uber, I want to say were there what, around 13,000 taxi medallions or 10,000, something like that. If the value of each of those was $1 million, I can't even do the math, but that's a lot of money. A million times 10,000, 10 billion maybe. Mm.
It was at 13,500 and there's still that many authorized. And it was the other story without diverging too much is the city was auctioning medallions to help balance its budget. So there's also,
So there's a
revenue,
revenue
right?
source for the
There
city
was a
too. Yeah.
revenue
So I
source.
think it's pretty safe to say that it was a big revenue source for a lot of important people. And that's really why Uber never kind of got it, its way. It's interesting that it's the only UberX market in the entire United States where drivers are licensed and provide commercial insurance. So I think that piece is interesting. Let's fast forward a little bit to today. Okay, so there were and are 13,500 taxis. Now I think there's what, over 100,000 rideshare vehicles in the city of New York. And then I think the medallion value, I'm guessing, has dropped a lot from that 1 million. So talk to me a little bit what's different from then till now.
Yeah, so I would say what's different from then to now is that the other thing that's unique about New York City is New York City has actually capped the number of vehicles Uber, Lyft, or any app can use. That's also an only in New York thing. So if you go to, you've obviously been here, Harry, but if other people in your, audience have
Yeah.
taken a trip in New York, the plates are always like T something something C, like a TLC plate. And so from before 2018, that was actually a free for all. So that's how Uber ultimately disrupted the industry here, that the supply increased. So in 2018, they capped, with exceptions that we don't have to get into, the number of Uber and Lyft cars or TLC
Mhm.
planes. So it's different between then and now is that's a major difference.
Yeah.
The number of vehicles that Uber and Lyft can access is limited. The
Got it.
second thing that's changed is there
And
are
what's that limit? Is it around?
it's a moving limit. It's not like the medallion industry where it's
Mm.
like 13,587. It's 100. There's about 104,000, 105,000 TLC plates right now. At its height, it was 120,000.
Got
They're
it.
still in a wheelchair accessible vehicle
Okay.
exemption kind of thing. But basically, it's 104 to 105,000. And
Okay.
once a year, the TLC makes a decision whether to release more TLC plates or not release TLC plates. So what's changed between then and now is now you have a structure where you have a vehicle license cap, not a driver's
Mhm.
license cap, that's reviewed once a year. And so that's different. You have a very stringent driver pay formula that
Yeah.
requires Uber and Lyft to utilize the number of drivers, which is on, they have to be busy X amount of time or there's basically a financial penalty. And then the third thing, which is recent, is Uber can more easily dispatch to yellow cabs now. So according to Uber, and you probably saw this, 20% of yellow cab trips right now are originating via Uber through the Curb app in New York City. That really didn't exist until about a year and a half ago.
Interesting. So people are basically going to the Uber app and either calling for an Uber next and a yellow cab shows up.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And there's some
Yeah.
tax benefits to that too, that a yellow cab doesn't have to pay 9% sales tax, and Uber, there's all this quirky stuff related to that.
Well, that's a good tease for another one of my guests that I'm going to have on soon, Hansu Kim from San Francisco, who runs Flywheel. I think we're going to talk all about that. So good teaser for that episode. Yeah. But you also mentioned the driver pay formula. And this is something that we've covered over on the Rideshare Guy quite a bit, because I want to say it is, from a driver friendly perspective, it's sort of one of the strongest protections for drivers, because it is a true minimum wage. And like you mentioned, I believe it's based off of the utilization from the past quarter. So if a company doesn't send drivers enough trips, then they basically raise the rates that they have to pay for drivers. And I mean, how is that going? Because I know a lot, at the start, a lot of drivers didn't like the fact that they were locked out of certain times and certain hours. But to me, I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? You can't go drive in the middle of nowhere and not not get any trips. They kind of need to send you when and where the trips are. So there are some trade-offs.
Yeah, no, I think the big controversy about lockouts was it gets back to like supply and demand dynamics. Because New York limits the vehicle supply. There's kind of this renter class in New York City, like 30% of Uber and Lyft. It's probably similar to Uber Black in other markets where, there's like a limited supply. And so drivers were saying, well, I want my own TLC plate, kind of that thing. And they weren't connecting that. Well, the more vehicle supply you have, and their trips are, limited and there's only so many to go around, then Uber is going to have to lock you out.
Yeah.
Right now, reverse argument of that is that, well, Uber can better manage the supply and all of that stuff. But I think net of everything, with a vehicle cap, if you have a vehicle cap, the utilization will solve for itself.
Right.
That was the argument. If you only have 105,000 vehicles to operate, if you can't keep your drivers busy with the 105,000 vehicles, the driver pay is like, you could argue, is like excessive. Like you have a vehicle cap and then you have the utilization.
Yeah, I think you're right. You sort of need the cap and the utilization. Well, I guess they're kind of this similar, right? If too many drivers, right? I'm sure the TLC looks, okay, all right, the companies are all complaining, they can't keep them utilized. Let's not release as many licenses next year, right? Oh, everyone's busy, things are looking good. Yeah. Let's release more, right? So I think the cap sort of works hand in hand, right?
Exactly. And so the lead up to the lockouts, without getting too deep, is there was a surprise electric vehicle plate release in October 2023. And there was like this lawsuit, a flood. Anyways, long story short, 10,000 plates were released.
Gotcha.
And then surprise, surprise, 4 months later, there's lockouts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And everybody's scratching their heads like, how did lockouts occur? It's like, will you increase the supply of vehicles by 10%? So lockouts follow. But that doesn't mean that Uber shouldn't be subject to regulations, but that was the immediate story with lockouts, I would say.
I think that's a very interesting and helpful background. And then I think you also mentioned, one thing I want to talk with you about is the sort of different business models happening in New York City. I mean, you mentioned a renter class. So it's my understanding that most drivers actually rent from a fleet owner in New York City. I mean, because there's this big barrier to entry, right? In LA, it's like, Harry, I've got my own car, I've got personal insurance, I go sign up for Uber. In New York City, as we've talked about, it's not like that. So there's a much bigger barrier to entry. And so what would you say, what percent of drivers, rent from a fleet owner in New York City?
I would say it's roughly 30-ish%. So of the 104,000, 5,000 TLC plates, and this is all in open data, like New York publishes data, about 30% of those are tied to a business, which is a proxy to, like, obviously a driver can rent their own car or their plate. Mm-hmm. But if you include the corporate rentals and like the peer-to-peer rentals, maybe it's 60-40. Like 60% are driving their own car and 40% are renting, but 10% of the 40% is like peer-to-peer
Hmm.
rental, basically.
So the renter's percentage, let's say it's 30 to 40%, it's actually not as high as I thought it would be. So they're renting from a big fleet owner. I think some who, you've interviewed in the past on your site, like American Lease, or I think Sally is in New York, some of the big ones. Who are the big fleet operators in New York City?
But there's, I would say, four are gigantic, I would say.
Mm.
American Lease is number one. They have over 7,000 vehicles, and I know them well. There's two brands that drivers will know, Buggy and Fast Track, but that's basically one company. They recently merged.
Mhm.
So combined, that company, Voyager Global Mobility, is number two. And then Tower is number three. And American Lease or Tower are predating Uber's rise. They
Mm.
were like big livery dealership type company. So they're predating it. And then you have a long string of like the Sallys and other companies like Nomad Friendly, which is like 100 to 1,000. So
Okay.
just in terms of distribution, like of the 30,000 corporate plates, like probably 15 to 18,000 are gigantic fleets. And then you have a player like me where I started, where I have like a 23 plate fleet, like just some
Gotcha.
small player with a long tail of, there's a long tail of those.
Well, we're going to talk about your fleet in a second, so don't ruin all the details because I think it's interesting, the business model you have. But okay, so it's actually, I thought that the percent, it's hot. It's a lot of cars, but it's also lower than I thought. So that means that 60 to 70% of drivers are basically owner operators of their own plates.
Correct. Yes.
And they're individuals. Are they usually the ones driving or do they rent it out to someone too? That individual.
For now, the market is defined as they're the ones driving.
Interesting.
So,
And so,
like if you took 100 Uber trips, like if you did a stress test of it, like 60 of them will say, "Yeah, I own the plate and I'm driving."
cool. And so let's talk briefly about your business model. I think you mentioned to me that you just own the plates, right? You don't actually rent out cars anymore.
Exactly. So where it started, I have like 2 or 3 rentals, but yeah, basically you're absolutely correct. What ended up happening is that I started out as an Uber Black only fleet.
Mhm.
And then the pandemic happened, all of this stuff. And then when I asked my drivers, like, hey, do you want me to buy a new car or do you want to buy your own car?
Mm.
Right? Like, upon the vehicle renewal cycle.
Mhm.
And they all kind of said, I would prefer to buy my own car. And so I said, okay, well, if you want to buy your own car, then you deal with the lease. It builds their credit score. They're just more comfortable. They have ownership in the car.
Yeah.
And then you charge them. Right now, the rates are between 100 and 125 per week for the plate. So it's pretty de minimis. Like it's not a big expense for them.
Yeah.
And then all other expenses are what they anyways would have paid if they owned the plate. Like if you own your plate, you're still paying insurance, you're still paying the DMV registration fee.
Yeah.
Now, it is no doubt about it. It's a much nicer business model for someone like me. I don't have any capital intensity. Other fleet owners are doing this too. But the medallion industry has a precedent. I feel like this market is kind of going towards the medallion industry where it's called DOV, a Dove model, where like you finance a car for 3 years and you rent a medallion. And the idea is eventually you either buy the medallion, and the TLC plate market is kind of a very dicey market, but like you can also buy TLC plates in certain circumstances if they're owned in a corporate entity. So you have this new kind of medallion-like market. Obviously, the 10 guys will hate that I'm saying that, but it's the reality of the situation that like someone can buy a TLC plate or let's say get the exclusive rights to it for 15,000 or 20,000 for, 5 years. Just like have the exclusive right and then own their own car and all of that stuff.
Yeah. So, we work with a lot of fleet owners across the country, and I always remark how tough and challenging the business is of shared fleets and renting them to drivers.
It's a terrible business.
Yeah, it's a terrible business, basically, to be.
If you don't have 2,000, and I had higher margin Uber, so that still was just survivable, and I screened my drivers. But as you probably know, Harry, unless you have 2,000 cars, the fleet business is like terrible business.
Yeah.
Hate to say it, it's terrible.
And so your business sounds a lot better. You've got 25 plates that you rent out for 100 to 125 bucks per week. And I think we should also, I guess, reiterate, this is a physical plate, right? Are you literally handing someone a plate with the physical metal plate?
Yeah, the physical plate you can hand it in. It's basically like this in the window, there's a blue sticker.
Got it.
in the window. So it's more you're really renting that blue sticker
Mhm.
to a driver. But yeah, it's medallion like. It's kind of like reminiscent
Mhm.
of probably tax medallion industry in like 1955 or something like
Yeah.
that.
So, I mean, all you really have to do, you still have the customer acquisition piece. You still need to find good drivers, good renters who are, obviously, if they're a good driver, they're going to keep paying you every single week for that plate, right? And so that's kind of what you're looking.
The most important, the other thing you have to be, this will crush fleet owners, is insurance management.
Mm.
So there's a big insurance company there's only two major insurance companies in the TLC industry, American Transit and Hereford. There's
Mhm.
big ones. American Transit is insolvent. So if you're a fleet owner, even if you're renting TLC plates, but you can't manage that, you're out of business because
Mhm.
your rental rates are going to skyrocket. So there is still a bit of insurance management to that business,
Yeah.
but it's like it's like a medallion basically. It's
Mhm.
the best way to describe it.
What is the insurance cost for some of your renters or some of your drivers?
So I have a very good loss run record, so I'm kind of in the top percentages of fleets, but it's usually part of it's on my corporate record and part of it's on the driver's record, like out there. Usually ranges between 6 and 8,000 for liability only.
Per
A
year.
lot of people don't have comprehensive and collision insurance in New York.
And that's per year.
Per year, exactly. Now, if you're an individual, the insurance rates are like between 4,500 and 6,000. If it's like an owner operator
Mhm.
policy, and
Okay. So it's a little low.
exactly, it's a lot lower. And then if you have a fleet captive, it can skyrocket to
Yeah.
10,000 plus.
But that is a good point. I mean, the liability, obviously, you hit someone and they sue you for $1 million. That's usually what you're trying to
And
protect
exactly.
against.
So I can't escape that, even as the plate owner. Like it's maybe easier to litigate, but the company's name, the registration is still in the company's name.
Right. But that doesn't include comp and comprehensive and collision. So if you're in a $75,000 Suburban and you get into an accident and there's $25,000 of damage, you're also on the hook for that, or you need to cover, get additional insurance to cover that.
Exactly. And in that instance, the driver owns the car, so they would pay for that comp and collision. The other thing that, in terms of plate rentals, I think why drivers like it is the flexibility. They leave the industry or, something like that. They'll
Yeah.
take their cars, so they have use. So there's different reasons for it, but I would say it's like the New York City industry is, New York City is kind of, there's some medallion elements to the Uber.
Yeah, it seems actually like a decent model for drivers since they get to, if they've got good credit or if they can get a good deal on a car, or, they know how to take care of their car, they're kind of responsible for that piece, which is expensive. If they're a good driver, their insurance rates will be lower, right? Like you said, part of it is on the driver. And then they still have to pay you 100 to 125 per week, but they do have some flexibility, right? If they want to do something else, they quit and they still have their car.
Plate and all of that stuff. What's funny is that drivers actually kind of like the value of TLC plates. So I know a couple of drivers who are quitting the Uber, like quitting rideshare in New York City, but they're renting out their TLC plates. They just don't want to part with them. So even in the driver's mindset,
Yeah.
this has arisen, and there's positives and negatives of it for sure. Just like similar to the medallion industry.
So I'm sure you've had some drivers come up to you and ask you to maybe buy a plate or, one of your plates that they're renting from you. What does a plate go for these days in New York City? What can I buy it for?
But this just happened the other day. So the only place, this is super important for the audience to understand, if a plate is in a individual name, it is not transferable. It is not a sellable plate. So then that 30% that is sellable, right? The big corporations, you'd have to buy the entire company. So that's not really marketable. So let's say there's about 12,000 TLC plates that are owned by LLCs between, 1 plate, 5 plates, 10 plates, all of that stuff. You have to pay a sales tax. You have to have a lot of compliance. If you have a clean corporate, my whole point, I'm going to get right into the price, is there are actually very few buyable clean corporations. If you do have one in a single LLC, I would say it's between 25,000 to 30,000 now. If you have it like one plate in one LLC, which is very rare. If you have like a LLC of 15 plates, I'd say it's right now like 15,000 a plate per plate. So in terms of tying that with the rental, it's like 3 years worth of paying the rent.
Oh, really? It seems like a lot more, right? Because it's 100 per week. You're right. So it's 100 times 52. So it's 5,200 a year. So you're sort of getting, yeah, like a 3x multiple is
3x.
15,000, and then 5x would be 25K.
And by the way, the TLC can wake up in March when they do these reports and say, you know what, we're releasing 2,000 plates. Boom, there goes the value, which happened in October. But yeah, that's like the pricing right now.
Interesting. Okay. So the reason why I kind of wanted to go over all of that background and, sort of set the stage is because I wanted to also ask you about Waymo and AVs more broadly entering the New York City market. I think we've made it pretty clear how valuable this market is, why AV companies are going to want to come, or already kind of banging on the door to come here. And so I know that right now, I mean, we talked about this at our summit in New York City. I believe that Waymo is testing on the streets of New York City. I don't think I saw one when I was there, but they have to have safety drivers in the car. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Have you seen one?
So I've seen one. Yeah, here I live on the west side of Manhattan. The unique thing about Waymo here, what people don't appreciate the details, is that in New York State, the way AVs are regulated, you have the DMV on a state level.
Mm-hmm.
Then in New York City, you have the Department of Transportation, where it actually technically regulates AVs. But this is what people miss out on. If you're doing a paid AV trip,
Mm-hmm.
that is actually regulated by the Taxi and Limousine Commission
Mm-hmm.
for hire vehicle license. As of now, who knows the regulations?
Right.
It
This makes sense, right? I mean, they're basically an Uber driver, but without a driver,
right?
And like you said, there's not a driver cap. There's a vehicle cap in New York City on for hire trips, right?
Exactly. And what's really just think of the numbers we spoke about. If I told you there was an employer in New York City that employs 120,000 people, which is Uber plus taxi,
Mm-hmm.
one of the largest employers in New York City. And so there's also like these two unions, driver union. There's a lot of it's a big industry.
And drivers in New York City are primarily full-time, right? Because they have these costs and, if they're paying a weekly rental fee or if they have this asset, I mean, it's kind of in their best interest to drive a lot, right? Versus
you just can't make it work expense-wise without being full-time. Maybe 10%.
So I guess my point there is, if there's 120,000 drivers, they're full-time drivers. That's like 500,000 regular Uber drivers in LA, people like me who are like 5 hours, 10 hours, here and there, right? So the quantity, it's kind of the quality over quantity too.
And this is their whole livelihood. And then there's an ecosystem of repair shops and, all this sort of stuff and government fees that are collected, sales tax that collected, tolls that are collected.
Yeah.
Is this whole huge ecosystem.
So we can touch on the regulatory side. I'm not sure how well versed you are there, but I also want to focus probably more on the business model side. If I'm Waymo, how do I get into New York City? How do I break into the market? How am I going to have my first, fleet of 100? They typically are launching with, let's call it 50 to 100 vehicles in a new city. How do I get my vehicles in New York City? What's your best guess?
So my best guess is, there's a Revel recently wound down. We reported on this, wound down their rideshare business. Waymo's going to do one of two things to offer pay trips. First, they got to lobby to get the assistant driver out of there, right? They'll either buy TLC plates. If they just want to launch 10 or 15 cars, just buy Rebel's plates or work with a medallion owner and rent.
Well, let's say they want to do 50 to 100 to start, because that's kind of their typical number.
So they would either buy TLC plates or work with a fleet owner to rent TLC plates. I mean, they can afford $100 a week. I don't think that's that much, right? And then they'll probably lobby separately along with Tesla. If I'm thinking how they're thinking, because this is an extra cost to them, right? I don't want a TLC plate. I don't want a medallion. I want an AV license. Like, why do I have to go through all of this rigmarole, right? The other political entity here that they can't ignore is the taxi medallion industry is coming back.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of political clout. My guess, so right now, Waymo wants to buy TLC plates or rent TLC plates just to launch the thing. That's not that big of a hurdle. It's not going to cost them that much money. Long term, they're either going to have to lobby for like a different license class or medallion and plate owners. There's going to be some sort of relationship there. And I don't own any taxi medallions directly. My guess is medallions have a higher probability of being AV licenses. Although I say that as someone who might be more incentivized to say TLC plates. I actually think medallions will have first dibs on, and there's already state legislation that is kind of suggesting that.
So if I'm Waymo or, another AV player, I'm sure there's quite a few that are looking at New York City for all the reasons we talked about. They can rent a TLC plate. That's pretty straightforward. They pay someone like you 100 to 125 bucks. And they only have, 100 cars in Austin, for example. So, they can launch with maybe 100. I mean, it's probably somewhat easy to rent 100 and it's not a huge cost.
Well,
They could
absolutely.
also buy those plates. I don't know if they really need to buy those plates though, because that's an even bigger cost. So it's likely that they might rent a TLC plate, or I guess the other option would be to kind of lobby for some kind of AV license on its own. And this would sort of be when I'm thinking, all right, when they're scaling to hundreds or 1,000 or thousands of vehicles. And what do you think are the main barriers to them getting, like, what's the number one, sort of obstacle they would face trying to get something, like 1,000 cars in New York City?
I think like running a fleet with vehicles in New York City, you have to have the real estate chart, all AVs are AVs. There's just a lot of infrastructure, like where the depot's at, insurance stuff, all of that stuff. I'm not a technologist. I can't speak to, I'm going to assume that the technology is there to navigate New York City. Outside of that would be just the running a fleet in New York City is a nightmare. I mean, even American Lease, who has 7,000 cars, will tell you that. You have to understand, like, okay, where the depot is going to be, where are you going to charge them, how are you going to utilize it? At 2 a.m., someone throws up in the car. There's a lot of like environmental factors. It's snowing, like who's going to change the tire, all of that stuff. So I think it's unlike any other city. Obviously, they're running in San Francisco, but San Francisco, I mean, I don't know San Francisco well. Like New York is a whole different animal to run a fleet in terms of weather, in terms of different street dynamics and all of that stuff. So it's very capital intensive, to be frank. And if I was Waymo, my suggestion to them would be have the driver or fleet buy the AVs and provide them the SaaS product or the network. I would not, but kind of like what Musk says, like the Tesla network approach. I think that has to be the model for them to own 2, 3, 4,000 cars. It just seems like a really tough business model.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's going to be hard for them to add 1,000 vehicles into New York City on their own, like they have done, I would say, maybe even easily, somewhat easily in LA, San Francisco, Austin. I mean, it's not, it's a challenging business like we've talked about, but I would say that they've done it pretty effectively. I think there could be some bigger, if not major, hiccups. I mean, I guess one on the regulatory side, I actually, kind of starting there without getting too much into details. I think that they'll be able to lobby and do all that, but I think you're right. I think there's going to be a lot of pushback from individual drivers. Where do you think they're going to actually, where do you think they might get the biggest pushback? Like who has the most to lose if there's 1,000 Waymos on the streets? Like individual drivers, fleet owners?
I think the individual drivers for sure. I mean, that's 120,000 livelihoods. Multiply that, let's say, but it's like the
But if
numbers.
there's more supply of drivers, if there's more, Waymos are always more supply, right? 1,000 full-time drivers come on the road. Well, maybe even more than full-time because they're Waymos. They only need to sleep a couple hours and charge a couple hours a night. So let's say, 1,000 Waymos hit the streets of New York City. I mean, there is this pay guarantee for drivers, right? So they still do have to make a certain amount. So even though I know drivers won't love 1,000 Waymos hitting the streets, I mean, the pay guarantee, they still will make, about the same,
What will practically happen is Uber and Lyft will secretly find, not secretly, they will just start deactivating drivers.
Yeah. So I think there'll be less opportunity for drivers, but the ones who, so maybe if you're not a great driver, you've gotten in accidents, you might be kicked off or you have less flexibility. So there's going to be less opportunity for drivers for sure.
Exactly. But you'll get it from them first. And then I would say number 2 would be medallion owners. There's a large hedge fund called Marblegate who has exposure to between loans and medallions, like 3 to 4,000.
So this would be the 13,500 taxi medallions.
Exactly. And it's a little different. Their pushback would be if Waymo or whoever wants to operate here, they need the medallion. So their pushback wouldn't be anti-AV.
They need
Their
a medallion
pushback,
instead of a TLC license.
exactly, or instead of a separate license, like that. If you want to do an AV in New
Right.
York, you need a medallion. So the driver pushback would be more like you're taking away my job, and the medallion pushback,
Mm.
the fleet owner pushback would be like, no, welcome to New York, but you need a TLC.
So anyone holding a medallion or a TLC license really wants more demand, right, for that medallion or TLC license, because then they can raise the price of the underlying asset or the weekly fee. So I see what you're saying. So really, there might be a little bit of a battle.
Just participate in the actual service. If you have
Right.
a TLC plate, if whatever company has enough TLC plates, if you have 7,000 TLC plates, you could just create your own AV. So,
Yeah.
you can cut a deal at the very least, where you even get some, fair income,
Yeah.
income that never existed. So it's kind of a weird dynamic with the vehicle license.
But the medallion owners are kind of head to head against TLC license owners, right? Like if Waymo comes into the city, if I'm a medallion owner, I want them to buy my medallion or rent versus.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, and to be fair to medallions, they paid, they're still worth $115,000, although a lot of people think, obviously the million was the headline figure. 100%. I think the medallion owners in there's not even hypothetical. There's New York State legislation that instills this, that if you want to operate an AV in New York State, that in a city with more than 1 million people, you need a tax medallion. Obviously, the five boroughs are the only places that have more than 1 million people. So 100%, the medallions will want to take care of themselves, but there's going to be more than a demand of 13,587. And I think maybe,
well, eventually, I mean, we're sort of at this interesting point where it feels like there are Waymos everywhere, but their fleet is only 2,000 vehicles right now in 5 cities, right? So
by the way, I read the driverless digest, obviously, and I think you obviously know what you're talking about, and you have really good content there. Is that I still think, in my opinion, this is like 7-10 plus thing away from mass adoption. Now, 3 years from now, it's going to become more and more obvious. So then, then you have to kind of game out the regulations. But you're right. For now, if Waymo wants to launch in New York City, just to have that, the photo shot, like the Waymo driving down Fifth Avenue, just rent a TLC plate or, rent a medallion.
we got a guy. We got a guy they can talk to.
Well,
so I think kind of thinking about some of their other obstacles that are more immediate. I mean, whether they have 100 or 1,000 cars. I mean, you mentioned the technology that you don't want to opine too much, but someone brought this up at our AV summit in New York City. Imagine a Waymo in the middle of Times Square, that's closed off, but that area where it's gridlock traffic, New Yorkers are not nice. I mean, there's actually a funny stat that I think the average passenger and driver rating in New York for Uber passengers drivers is like 0.2 below the national average, just as a baseline. Like they're just meaner. Like everyone's rating is just 0.2 lower, which I always thought was funny. And I wonder, so I do feel like, I guess, just navigating the streets of New York, like I don't think anyone's going to let a Waymo in, to be honest. And there are times where you kind of need to be, very, very aggressive, right?
I'll say the other thing about this, and I don't know if any of your guests have mentioned this, I think there's a real risk of insurance fraud. Like New York, I mean, that's why it could be argued that's why the largest insurance company in New York City, TLC insurance company, is solvent. There's a lot of insurance fraud. So I could easily imagine like, oh, there's a Waymo, let me lie in front of it or let me run into it. Right? Yeah. And then you have Celino and Barn type, like personal injury firms.
Yeah, this is a big issue for Uber and a lot of.
I just think that is something that people are like, oh, that'll be figured out. It's like it's that easy of a thing, and who has the liability and everything. But yeah, I would say weather also, and like it's a skyscraper city, so there's shadows and different stuff like that. But I think they can solve for it. But I think. They say they're at the 90% to get to the incremental 10% to perfection. I think it's kind of difficult, but they'll get there. I have no doubt, but I think it's, I think it's 7-10 years at this point, but how technology advances.
Yeah, they're actually, I didn't realize this because I only visit New York in the fall once every year or two when it's good weather. But New York apparently does get some pretty nasty weather. I mean, they're at an average snowfall of 29.8 inches, relative to Boston, 48 inches. We shared this chart in our newsletter recently. They get 50 inches a year of rain. I think that's one, though, that Waymo, they just made this big announcement about snowy cities. I feel like that's a challenge, but I think that's solvable. I don't know if there's any other specific kind of technology. The only thing I could think of is just like New Yorkers are kind of mean, and I think it's going to be challenging. Like,
Totally, you hit the nail on the head. I think you're hitting. That's like I think.
I think that's the only unique thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm walking here, like that
Yeah.
sort of stuff.
Also,
So
like the
no,
number, people are jaywalk. It's kind of like a different city, and I think it's solvable. But I think that it'll be interesting to see. I'm not gonna make any predictions just yet, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The other thing you mentioned that I think is interesting is the fleet business is tougher than other cities. Can you expand on that a bit? I mean, you mentioned real estate, like real estate in Manhattan. I talked to some of my friends that are paying rent, and I was kind of shocked at how much more expensive it is than Los Angeles for real estate. Obviously, I'm guessing a lot of these guys need to charge their cars, in the city or just outside the city, and you can't be too far away. So those costs really add up. I mean, what are some of the unique kind of fleet business owner challenges that are sort of unique to New York City versus others? Like everyone pukes in the back of a Waymo, whether it's LA or San Francisco or New York, but I guess like where you clean that vehicle, the real estate might be a lot more expensive in New York.
I think I would say the number one issue for fleets right now, especially with an EV mandate, is
Mhm.
that in the 5 boroughs of New York, if you're allocating any amount of land to charging infrastructure, it's probably very hard to financially justify that that's the best
Mm,
investment for that property. And so
gotcha.
right now, there's only like 300 or 400 charging fast chargers in New York
Mm,
City. So all AVs are EVs, right?
mm,
And with the like right now, and them, American Lease, they bought 2 or 3 thousand Fiskars. If
yeah.
you ask them probably what their number one problem is,
Hmm.
or their driver's number one problem is just like the charging infrastructure. And
Yeah.
then you got to convince, imagine you're a real estate developer in Brooklyn, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
I wanna build like a 30-story luxury unit here. I don't wanna
Yeah.
build like a fast charging hub, and then those being in the right locations, and then the grid is
Mm,
also like a big thing. I'm not an expert at this. I'm sure you've had people who can speak to it better than I can. So I would say if you're running a traditional fleet that needs depots of any sort to store cars,
mhm.
real estate is very expensive. So you really need a fully utilized fleet. You need those cars being out on the road.
Yeah, that kind of a topic I've been thinking about is the sort of utilization versus real estate charging locations, right? Like I'm almost thinking that, maybe in some of these places, like it might make sense to, go 30, 40 minutes, away from the city where you can get reasonable real estate. Maybe you charge at level 2 speeds instead, 30, 40 miles an hour and get an overnight full charge instead of level 3 where you're getting, 100 miles an hour and that fast charge because of that real estate arbitrage. So yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I think that's definitely for a city like New York going to be a big obstacle is the charging.
Absolutely. And I think I have some drivers who have EVs, still Uber Black EVs. I have a
Mm,
guy with the Lyric. He called me the real story. He called me the other day and he's like, I want to hand in my Lyric to get a XT6.
mhm.
And then I said, why? I said, there's more to the story. He's like, some drivetrain malfunction. It's an $8,000 job and only the dealer can do it. And I'm sick of this car. And he was not happy. I'm not saying that's reflective of all EVs, but
Mhm.
like they just don't like time is, there's a very like, because of the full-time nature of
Yeah.
the job, it's very like time is money type of thing here. And no one has very few people have like garages to
Yeah.
park in. So it's like, yeah,
Yeah, definitely. No, well, I think it's very interesting. And I mean, I think it's clear that you are one of the, if not the leading expert on this New York City TLC market. And, even though I kind of joked before that it's a bit of a niche, it's actually quite a big industry. And there's a lot of, a lot of opportunity, a lot of players, and I think a lot of interest that we're seeing right now with the industry at itself and, the future of AVs. It's also very secretive. So I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and you do a great job sharing all of your information with interviews and your newsletters sellers over on Auto Marketplace. So thank you for that. We'll leave a link in the show notes so people can find more information about you and your website. I kind of want to leave you with this final question. What are some key New York City mobility issues to watch, whether AV or, today industry? What do you have your eye on?
I would say I definitely have my eye on, so this is kind of a weird one to choose, but I'll choose it. The actual dedicated curb space related to vehicles is shrinking rapidly. So full lane, I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing. I'm just stating the facts of it, where there's like bus lanes coming. There are full car lanes that are converting into bicycles. You have congestion pricing. So I would say congestion is a major consideration. Like you have congestion fees and all of that stuff, and curb space is getting limited. So I don't know if I guess it's not an issue or not an issue, but anybody who's trying to game out how the regulations are going to play out, there's this macro thing that's happening that the city wants less cars on the street. They want public transit to be used more. And so it's not an issue per se, but like they recently regulated mopeds, or I think there's a 15-mile-per-hour limit now.
Yeah.
E-scooter.
E-bikes.
E-bikes, exactly. And so I think if you're operating in New York City market, you got to be ready to game out regulations before making a single investment. Like there's so many different regulatory things going on. And so to leave you on this, those 23 plates I had were before any vehicle cap. That's when everything was free for all. I had never bought a TLC plate. And I think, I'm not saying that in the future, who knows, maybe I'm a lucky guy and it goes to 1 million in 10 years and then I'm in my villa, right? But I'm not betting I'm not like buying TLC plates to
Gotcha.
There's a market to be made here. And so I think with Auto Marketplace, I want to be like, I'm just trying to help make the market that I'm going to buy a medallion, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, because I think, this commissioner will do this and that. So I would say the biggest thing in mobility.
Hard to predict.
Very long-winded answer, but you got to be ready for politics and regulatory, like gamesmanship in a way that I think is very different than other places.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well said. And I appreciate your answer on the curb, since I do have a conference every April in Los Angeles called Curbivore, where we talk a lot about these issues where shrinking curb space and AVs and delivery people and bikes and, people want to walk. So anything that touches the curb, which is basically allows me to do a conference about everything in the mobility space. So maybe we'll get you out there this year. Dawood, really appreciate you coming on. If folks want to find more about yourself, learn about Auto Marketplace, where can they go? What should they type in?
Easiest place, automarketplace.com. We just launched this site. It has different indexes for the plates, for medallions, for insurance costs. And then there's a newsletter, which we are more known for on Substack. But if you go to automarketplace.com, you can go to the newsletter there.
All right. Yeah, no, congrats on launching that new website. I need to take a look at all the indices. I know you've given me a little one-on-one preview, so I'm excited to check them out. And, I'm a weekly reader of your newsletter too. So you guys are doing great work. And thank you so much for coming on.
No, thank you for having me, Harry.
Thanks for watching today's episode of the Rideshare Guy podcast. For more information on today's guest, please check the description. Now, you don't want to miss this interview of the Rideshare Guy podcast, so click here and also make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future ones. See you next time.